Buenos días a todas, todos. Veo que ya se están
Good
conectando.
morning, everyone. I see that we are gradually connecting.
Mariana, Hugo, Germán, Zulma.
Lorena,
Perdón, no me
Hugo,
pude
Germán, and
registrar.
Sulma,
Bien tenía
thank you
todas
for renaming
el
yourselves.
equipo de celular de Zulma registrado en el nombre como
Yesterday,
Zulma.
Sulma's cell phone was her
Susana,
ID,
qué
and
gusto.
now she renamed herself. Thank you,
La
Sulma.
virtualidad.
Thank you so much.
Bueno,
It
muy
just
buenos
truly
días a
helps.
todas y todas. Es
Good
un
morning.
placer
It is a
el
great
día de hoy
pleasure to
estar aquí
welcome
con
you back
ustedes
to our
en
second
este
session
segundo día
of
de
Restoring Hope in Colombia.
conocimientos, además en base a lo que ya avanzamos
And we
día
hope to
de
build
viernes.
upon
Hoy nos vamos a
what
enfocar
the
en la
information that we heard
planificación
yesterday. So
sistemática
today
de la
we're going
conservación
to
para
focus on
restituir los
systematic
restaurantes
conservation
y las
planning for
esperanzas en
restoring
Colombia
hope in
y
Colombia for
enfocándonos
our
además en
project.
la
And
data
we're also going to
usada
focus
a
on
la
the
hora de
data to be
estos
used
cierres.
for this
Entonces,
project.
antes de empezar, quisiera dar algunas pautas logísticas
Now, before we
también
begin,
porque se van
I'm
incorporando
going
muchísimos
to
más
cover some
colegas.
logistics,
En
which is
primer
always a good
lugar,
idea.
contaremos con interpretación en simultáneo en español y en inglés, ya que
We're going
algunos
to
de
have
nuestros
Spanish
presentadores
and
están
English
hoy
interpretation, just because
tomando
some of our
rol.
speakers
Muchas
and
gracias
our
a Sara,
listeners
Said
uh,
y Verónica,
are
nuestras
not bilingual.
intérpretes
So
del día de
uh,
hoy.
we think
Para
it is
activar la
best
interpretación, ustedes tienen un botón en la parte baja de su
to use
pantalla, que
interpretation.
es un
Now,
mundo que dice
we have
interpretación
a
o
globe.
interpretation. Y ahí eligen el idioma de su preferencia. Yo ahora mismo me estoy yendo al canal del español. Listo, entonces si me pudieran hacer un gesto, una reacción del pulgar arriba que están de acuerdo con la interpretación, en este caso quienes están escuchándome en inglés, listo,
I
perfecto,
apologize.
muchísimas gracias.
So just the
Y
logistics
les
and make sure that you
recomendamos, por
connect to the
favor,
right channel
hablar de manera
of your choice.
pausada. eh,
Speak
Aquí
slowly if
en el
possible.
desayuno latino es muy
Remember that
importante,
sometimes,
por favor,
as
para que los
Latin Americans,
intérpretes
it's easy for us
puedan
to speak
seguir
fast.
el discurso
Also, Spanish
y
has more words.
interpretarlos en
So
lenguaje
remember
al
to
instante.
just keep a
Si
slower pace
tienen
for the
algún
interpretation.
problema técnico, por favor,
If you have any
reporten
technical
su
issues,
situación
send a
a
message
Marion
to
Marie,
Marion Mario,
que está
and she
también
will
ahorita
be
en el chat
listening and ready to answer your
compartiendo la
questions.
información.
You could also
Agradecería
send her an email,
muchísimo el chat
but please
general
do
para no
not
distraernos
uh,
en estos temas
send the
más
message to the
técnicos
general
de
chat
la
because it's
plataforma.
going to add
Y
to
en la
more of
parte
the
superior. Sus
uh,
micrófonos van a estar
it's going to be
silenciados por
confused
si
with the
acaso
information
por
of
la
the meeting.
sesión para garantizar que nos escuchemos
So
entre
just be
todos.
sure
De
that
todas formas, luego de cada
you connect
sesión
to a channel. It is
siempre
important
tendremos
to do that.
espacios de
And
preguntas
then we
y
will have a
respuestas.
Q&A session at the
Ustedes
end.
pueden levantar la mano. Hay una opción también en la parte de abajo de su
You can
pantalla
raise
de
your hands at the bottom of
levantar
your
la mano.
screen
También pueden levantar la mano
and
con la
raise your
cámara
hands.
encendida, así como estoy haciendo ahorita.
And you can
O
also just
pueden subir
turn
su
on your
micrófono
camera and
y
raise your
continuar
hands, as I just
haciéndose la
did.
presentación y al final
So
yo la leeré como sucedió el día de ayer. Recuerden que vamos a compartir con ustedes un documento sintetizando todas las
we're
preguntas que
going
nos
to then send you a
hiciste
document
el día
synthesizing all the
de hoy y
answers
ayer.
and what
Esto va a
we
estar contenido
spoke
en una
about.
carpeta de Drive, donde
So
además
we also have a
las
drive, a Google
presentaciones
Drive
y
folder.
grabaciones
It's
de estas sesiones juntos.
that will be
Mi
available
colega
to you.
Marión va a compartir con
And Marion
ustedes
will now
ese
share the
link
link
en el
to
chat.
the Google Drive.
Y bueno, antes de que empecemos, me gustaría darle la palabra a Liliana Corso, nuestra consultora nacional experta en involucramiento de actores
So we're now going to
económicos,
speak
para dar algunas
to
reflexiones de lo
Liliana
que fue el primer
Corso, who is
día
Stakeholder
de
Engagement
aprendizaje.
Head, and she's going to speak about a summary of what occurred yesterday. Thank you so much, Cassandra. Thank you for your attendance. And what I wanted to emphasize was the great attendance we had yesterday. It just shows that although we have been working on issues of restoration in the country for many years, planning and implementation, it's a topic that still garners our attention. And this shows also that we are resilient, that we want to continue to make headway. And it leads to the second point, which has to do with our goals. And as Enrique mentioned, Natasha and Zoraida in their presentations, we have global and national goals that are very relevant and challenging at the same time. So this forces us to adequately use our and plan our resources. So in Colombia, we have been making headway with this on one hand, on the restoration side, which is in construction, and as Natasha said, technical aspects as well, as Paola mentioned. So we can begin from what has been constructed and use innovative methods that will help integrate all the different data that has been generated from different institutions. And this leads us to SCP, which is the topic that we addressed yesterday, systematic conservation planning. We're going to speak about this in a more methodological manner.
Bueno, resaltar como esta temática tan importante, que seguimos aprendiendo, seguimos avanzando.
So we're
Bueno,
going to continue to move forward, and I would like to emphasize the invitation that we are making, that the ministry is making for the on-site meeting on August 29th. You're all invited. Thank you so much, Liliana. And just to remind participants, as we did yesterday, to make sure to go to the participants list and rename yourselves. Where it says, where there's a plus, you rename yourselves there. So I'm just explaining how to change your names. Let me just go ahead and do that. So it's a very simple process. So it's very important to state your institutions. That way we know who we're addressing in our different discussions, since there are such a varied audience. Next slide. So we're going to build on what we worked on yesterday with systematic conservation planning. We're going to focus on reviewing spatial data that's going to be used to run the analysis for this project. On this slide, you can also see the today's agenda, and it begins with our scientific lead, Dr. Oscar Venter, and it has to do with use of systematic conservation planning to be able to create the restoration map. And then we're going to have Dee Zhang. She's the expert in territory and biodiversity from the Nature for Life program of the UNDP. We're going to speak about the data that's already available for Colombia based on our ELSA project, and then perform an exercise after we look at the data and any gaps in data that exist. So we're then going to speak about the restoration map, and Jameson Irvin is going to take the floor, and she's manager of the Global Program on Nature for Development at UNDP. And the objectives of this session are to present how systematic conservation planning can support prioritization of efforts in restoration in Colombia and identify national data sets that are pertinent to meet restoration policy commitments in Colombia. So if anyone has a comment about the agenda, please drop that into the chat. So we're going to begin with our first session that will focus on how we can use systematic conservation planning for Restoring for Hope project in Colombia. And this is going to be led by our scientific lead, Oscar Venter, who will join us, who's joining us in this session. Thank you, Oscar. It's a pleasure to have you as always. You have the floor.
Okay, thank you, Cassandra, for the introduction, and Liana for the summary of yesterday, and to everybody else for attending the session today. So in the next 40 minutes, I'm going to describe our current methodology to use systematic conservation planning and essential life support area methods to help identify restoration priorities in Colombia. The methods are in development, so as I present, there's a few places where I'm putting questions forward to you as a group that we can come back and discuss at the end of the presentation. I also want to mention that we recognize that there's a huge amount of excellent work being done around identifying restoration priorities in Colombia already. The great work by Humboldt to identify landscape integrity and by the ministry to develop restoration policy. So we are really careful here to make sure that what we're proposing and doing is building off this existing work. We just hope that we can bring a couple of new elements to restoration planning, in particular, using systematic conservation planning. We spent some time yesterday introducing those concepts and why they're useful. But then also we'd like to move from just restoration priorities in general to identifying specifically places where ecological recovery versus ecological rehabilitation versus ecological restoration might be a priority. So kind of breaking out that restoration into the types of restoration that actually occurs in Colombia. Next slide, please. Our primary purpose for wanting to do this is to really build off all the work that went into mapping essential life support areas in Colombia, all the work into identifying spatial priorities for the environment. This wasn't only an effort to gather national spatial data, though a lot of effort went there, but other key components was the integration of a whole diversity of policy commitments from Colombia for the environment. The essential life support area work reflected 10 policy priorities within Colombia that can be achieved from protecting, managing, restoring nature. But also they also harnessed stakeholder opinions into what was the most critical environmental values and what should be achieved through restoration, protection, and management. So within our work is spatial data, but also it's all these policy commitments and stakeholder weights. Next slide, please. Just wanted to quickly add one more point about why systematic conservation planning is a useful tool. And the basic point here is that making decisions, environmental decisions using spatial data represents a very big and complex problem. This is a made-up landscape I'm showing you. It's only 300 different pixels. We call them planning units when we do planning. Now, if you were tasked with deciding which of these pixels or planning units to restore, the number of options you need to evaluate is greater than the number of atoms in a known universe. And that means which pixels you plan to restore or choose to restore, the number of different ways you could choose those planning units is basically infinite. This is 300 planning units. For Colombia, we have around 10 million planning units. So using systematic conservation planning tools helps us better evaluate the optimal way to act in these complex landscapes. Next slide, please. So I'm going to just very briefly give you an overview of the systematic conservation planning approach and how it can be used in Colombia for identifying restoration priorities. So the SCP approach we use is called the maximum coverage approach. It means that we want to meet area-based targets for taking action in ways that maximize environmental benefits. So next slide, please. In the case of restoration in Colombia, the area-based targets, there's two options. The first option is the current national commitment to restoring an additional 750,000 hectares of ecosystems in Colombia. So this is roughly less than 1% of Colombia's land area. We view this as probably in addition to other areas which have already been restored and are mapped within the registration registry for the country. So that's the national target. There's also a global target of protecting 30% of degraded areas. So to action this target, you first have to map degraded areas. Thankfully, Humboldt's done a fantastic job of doing that, as they presented, Paola presented yesterday in the landscape integrity work. I'll just ask the interpreters, am I speaking too fast or is this okay?
You're fine. You're fine.
Okay, thanks. So the 30% target, when we use the Humboldt landscape integrity, this works out to about 15% of Colombia's land area. So we have two area-based targets, one national and one global target. The second part of using systematic conservation planning for restoration is to map places where restoration is feasible. We call these hard constraints. So where in Colombia can restoration be considered? Where can it absolutely not be considered? For this step, so yeah, thank you. And you can go one more slide. I'll try and remember my queuing. To map where restoration is feasible, this is a place that we can really harness and build off the Humboldt work on landscape integrity. Places where restoration is feasible is really places which have been degraded. So for this work, for this step, we're able to use a Humboldt landscape integrity layer. We consider all areas which are very low integrity or low integrity as places where restoration might be feasible. So a question here that we could cycle back to at the end of this presentation is this the right way to map where restoration is feasible? And should we only be considering low and very low integrity places, or should we also consider medium integrity places? Feel free to put your thoughts to these sorts of questions into the chat, or you can save them for the end. Next slide, please. The final step for identifying restoration priorities using systematic conservation planning is to use spatial data that can guide the selection of areas that maximize benefits for ecosystem diversity, land cover integrity, and ecosystem services. So those three large categories that are used by Humboldt, we're considering similar categories, though we're using different spatial data for each of these categories. We call the actual spatial layers our planning features, and Dijan will be presenting next after me, really looking at all of those different spatial data in much more detail. So I'm not going to go into detail for them right now. Next slide, please. But I will just quickly show you our overall maps. These three maps are kind of a heat map that sums all of the individual planning features together for ecosystem diversity in the left panel, land cover diversity in the central panel, and ecosystem services in the right panel. So I think there might be over 20, maybe close to 30 individual spatial layers that are used to form each of these three maps, and you'll be looking at them in more detail a little bit later. So these are the three core areas to using systematic conservation planning for restoration. Priority setting. This is to set an area-based target. We have two of those. To identify where restoration might be feasible. This is harnessing the Humboldt's work. And then finally, to look where the benefits might be maximized. And then we can put that all together and bring that into a systematic conservation planning tool. We use Prioritize R because it's basically the most accurate and fastest tool for systematic conservation planning. And Prioritizer gives us an output which shows us priority areas to restore that meet the area-based target, maximize benefits. Next slide, please. So this is basically our first version of the map. Again, our work is still underway, so don't look at this as a final priority map, but this is the first output. We only got it a few hours ago, last night, thanks to the hard work by Scott Atkinson, our spatial analysis lead on the project. So in orange here, you're showing places that would maximize environmental benefits if restored, while achieving a 30% of degraded areas in Colombia. So that's around roughly 15% of the land area. Next slide, please. So you can see there's in many ways a strong agreement between our initial beta map and Humboldt landscape integrity map. You can see places of very low and low integrity in Humboldt map showing up as priorities in this systematic conservation planning derived map. There are some differences, some places which aren't being transferred from the low integrity map into the priority map. I think it'll be interesting as the work unfolds to kind of contrast these two maps in more detail, but there's not a lot of purpose in doing that while it's still draft work. Okay, next slide, please. So I said we wanted to build off restoration priority setting to kind of unpack it more, to think about where restoration versus rehabilitation versus recovery might be the best action to take. And this is because Colombia considers these three various forms of restoration. I think that's very wise because they are quite different and they are suitable in different places. Next slide, please. So let's just take a quick look at what these terms mean. So ecological restoration is to restore, now these are Colombian definitions, not global ones. Ecological restoration is to restore the degraded ecosystem back to a condition that is similar to the pre-disturbance ecosystem with respect to its integrity. So it's basically trying to bring it back to what it was. In terms of composition, what species are there, structure, and functioning. Those are the three elements of integrity, ecological integrity. So you have this restoration. It's kind of the highest ecological restoration. It's the highest form of restoration. Next slide, please. From there, you have ecological rehabilitation. So this is to repair the productivity and or ecosystem services in relation to the functional or structural attributes. So not necessarily bringing all the original species back, not necessarily restoring the original ecosystem. So this is still quite a high form of restoration. It's repairing productivity and services, functional and structural attributes, but not necessarily back to the original ecosystem. Next slide, please. The final form of restoration is ecological recovery. This is to return the usefulness of the ecosystem for the provision of environmental services other than the original ecosystem. So this is basically just trying to make it a more functional system such that it can provide ecosystem services. So it doesn't have nearly as high of a bar in terms of restoration and conservation outcomes. So really interesting three different strategies here. So we wanted to think a little bit about, well, where might each one of these strategies be relevant when we look at our restoration priorities. So we've come up with, next slide, please, a general approach to this. And that is, when we look at the restoration priority map, places for full ecological restoration might be places which have lower human footprint and where the ecosystem is not predicted to change because of climate change. We know that climate change is going to shift ecosystems very significantly in Colombia. So restoration should occur in places where those shifts are not predicted to occur. Next slide, please. So, sorry, this map's not, we didn't have time to kind of tweak this map, but if you look at the bottom right panel, this shows you in red places where ecosystems are projected to change. So we don't really want to restore, to go through all the effort of restoring an ecosystem back to what it was if climate change is going to change it anyway. So from these data, we're looking for places where ecosystems are meant to be the same biome in the future as they are now under projected climate change. This could be considered for restoration. And then next slide. Colombia has excellent national data for Humboldt and Andres Eder on the human footprint. This is kind of all of human infrastructure. So places with lower human footprint might be suitable for full restoration if it's a whole bunch of roads and people living there in cities and such. It's really not possible to restore it back to the original system. So we use these data to look for places that had lower footprint as well to consider for restoration, as well as not being agriculture or urban areas. It's really hard to take those out of production and bring them fully natural again. So places that are restoration priorities, stable under climate change, lower human footprint, not agriculture, not urban, are places that we feel full ecological restoration might be feasible. Next slide, please. For rehabilitation, ecological rehabilitation, we considered similar factors in terms of lower human footprint, not agriculture, not urban, but we considered that climate change could shift the biome. So it could move from one ecosystem type to another under climate change, because rehabilitation is not about going back to the original form. It's about increasing ecological integrity with regards to structure and function. So even under climate change, if the climate was to perturb the system, it could still be rehabilitated. And then next slide. The final specific strategies, ecological recovery. We considered this as places that were restoration priorities, but were in the higher human footprint areas, making it probably infeasible to either rehabilitate or to restore fully, as well as areas that are agriculture or urban. And we felt here that climate change didn't really matter so much, because it's just about increasing the function to some extent with regards to ecosystem services. And it didn't matter so much whether the biome would change. So this is one of the areas that we're trying to innovate and contribute to the restoration planning in Colombia, moving from restoration generally to the specific strategies used in Colombia, using data on climate change, human footprint, and land cover. So it'd be interesting to hear any thoughts on this as a general approach to moving from restoration to ecological restoration versus ecological rehabilitation versus ecological recovery. Next slide, please. We've been working as hard as we can to try and get this work together. We haven't yet implemented those, the methods that I just showed you. Next time we meet, or we were able to share this work, we would plan to have that map of priorities to restore, rehabilitate, and recover. Okay. Oh, sorry, and you can go one more slide. Sorry for leaving you behind. Marianne, if you could just, thank you, perfect. The next thing we wanted to touch on was estimating the cost of restoration. We haven't really dived into this in any sort of detail, but we do think it's important to try and cost these efforts. We did find some initial numbers. Paola presented some, which we hadn't seen yesterday, which is great to see. We also found some other numbers from two papers in working in Colombia. The first is a paper by Andres Eder, published 3 years ago in Land Use Policy, which estimated the cost of full land purchase followed by passive restoration. So not actively planting trees, but rather letting the ecosystem recover. So they estimated somewhere between $300 and $1,200 per hectare in places which are less accessible, and so not highly accessible places here. So this would mean that for the low ambition national target of 0.67% of land cover, it might be a one-off cost of $225 to $900 million upfront cost. The high ambition target of roughly 15% of Colombia, that's the 30% international target, would result in with these data, a one-off cost of $34 to $137 billion. So very high cost there. There was some other data which we found around, instead of purchasing land, doing payments for ecosystem services to incentivize restoration. And this was equal to roughly US $40 per hectare per year. And this is payments for places that are used for pasture land. This would mean that the low ambitious target would cost roughly 30 million US per year, and the high ambition target would cost roughly 4.6 billion US per year. And sorry, I shouldn't have really put these in US dollars. Next slide, please. And one more. I just want to speak to the limitations of that cost data I presented. First, it only applies to passive restoration, not active restoration. It also doesn't differentiate the cost of ecological recovery versus ecological rehabilitation versus ecological restoration. And finally, it only applies to areas which are a low accessibility or pasture lands. So that's the limitations just based on what data was available. There's also something else. This is just the one direction costs of restoration. A number of the presentations yesterday highlighted things like the Gupta review and other results which point to the restoration economy. It points to all the economic benefits, the benefits to people from restoring ecosystems. So when we look at the costs of restoration, we're only looking at kind of the bad side. We don't grapple with all those amazing benefits you get from restoration, like all the ecosystem services, buffering from climate change and natural disasters, improved water quality and quantity. All those benefits also come from restoration. So I actually don't even really like the approach of estimating costs only if you're not going to estimate benefits at the same time. It's really one-sided, and it makes you think, oh, we can't afford this, when really there might be a net economic benefit from restoration. And I have just one more slide. I think I'm getting close to my time, so that's good. I just want to propose one other method. So right now we've been cost agnostic. We haven't considered cost at all in the analyses when we're doing our optimizations for using systematic conservation planning, which means that some of the restoration priorities might be in places where it's quite costly to restore. Now, we are able to actually bring costs into the optimization to try and identify priorities where restoration might be cheaper or most cost effective. We wouldn't bring this in with actual dollar costs. Those data don't exist, but we could use spatial data that serve as proxies for the cost of restoration. So these might be data on agricultural suitability of land, because the most agriculturally suitable land, it tends to be much higher cost to restore or to purchase. Or it could be things like the human footprint data, places with lots of human infrastructure and lots of presence of humans tend to be more expensive to acquire or restore. So we could bring these sorts of proxies for the cost of restoration into the actual optimization. So we could generate priority maps for restoration that minimize conflict with those sorts of costs. This isn't something we've done yet, but something that we're happy to do before kind of producing the final maps, priority maps for restoration, rehabilitation, recovery. Okay, I want to thank everybody for their time. I presented quite a lot there. Thank you for listening. Again, this is work in progress, so we really value any feedback. You saw throughout the presentation in red some kind of questions that I thought you might be interested in discussing, but also happy to take any other questions or discussion that you might have. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Oscar, por la presentación. Sí, ya tenemos algunos.
Thank you, Oscar, for the presentation. We have reactions and questions. First, Daniela Peñalosa says from the Environmental Ministry, what do you think is the way to make restoration more attractive? Because we need plenty of resources and time to implement it in a successful manner.
Thank you for that excellent question. I'm not going to pretend like I really know the answer to that. So I'm just going to give you my thought. I'd also be happy to hear anyone else's thoughts, but I think the one way to make restoration more attractive is, instead of focusing on just the costs, like I quickly presented here, to rather try and quantify the economic benefits that would be derived from restoration. We have excellent maps that show various ecosystem services such as carbon sequestration, water provision, disaster risk reduction, but we don't have any data that convert those into economic values. So I would say any work that could start moving from maps of services to quantifying the economic benefits to people, to communities of those services that come from restoration would help make it more attractive.
Muchas gracias, Oscar. También Paola Isaacs del Instituto Humboldt ha compartido.
Paola Isaac has shared the costing work done by the Humboldt Institute, and Paloma is downloading the information, a repository, and Susana left a message. The costs do not consider relative state of each ecosystem. So perhaps you can decide to invest more in its restoration. And Susana said, okay, along those lines, I ask about the pertinence of prioritizing by ecosystem, not putting all the ecosystems in a single prioritization exercise.
Thank you, Susanna. I'll address the last point first. We had internal discussions about that question that you make. So basically, there's two targets for restoration year. Let's say about 1% of the country and about 15% of the country. We've applied it to the country overall, not saying that a particular ecosystem type needs to be restored to a certain level. The other approach that you're suggesting here is to actually break it out by ecosystem. So it might be taking, for instance, that global target of 30% of degraded areas, and then be mapping the degraded areas for each ecosystem and saying that 30% of them should be restored. We discussed that as an option, and we'd be very happy to do that if that was the way people wanted to go. We just didn't do it for the first version because the global target doesn't refer to breaking it out by ecosystem. For target 3 around protecting 30%, it does specifically say ecologically representative, which indicates that it should be broken up by ecosystem, but the restoration target doesn't, as far as I'm aware. So I think that's a great point. You don't want to only be restoring one biome type. You probably want to restore a mix of biome types.
Muchas gracias, Oscar. También tenemos el comentario de
Thank you,
Fabio.
Oscar. Do we have Fabio's comments?
La pregunta, mejor dicho, ¿cuáles son los beneficios de
What are the
elaborar mapas de
benefits
prioridades de
of
restauración?
producing restoration priority maps when the restoration processes are planned, designed, negotiated, and established at a local scale?
Thank you for the question. I had a little bit of trouble with my audio, so I missed some of the beginning. But I think, and just tell me if I'm wrong, but I think the question is, what's the purpose of using spatial data at the national scale and developing these priority maps when really it's decision-making and actors at local scales that decide on what to restore? Is that the question, Cassandra? Okay, thanks. That's a great question, and it's always a question for spatial analyses at broad scales. So I think the first point is that these restoration priority maps, they are not a blueprint for restoration. They're not meant to be taken and go straight to those places and take action. They are a guidance tool for restoration planning. The purpose of the tool is that they've harnessed all this amazing spatial data that we have now that we just did not have 10 years ago. It's incredible how we can look in detail across great areas, across the whole area of Colombia using these spatial data. So these maps can serve as guidance, but ultimately the decisions will be taken based on what opportunities exist on the ground, who are the thought and decision leaders, who supports things like restoration, who doesn't, where are these actual opportunities on the ground. The most we could hope for is that there would be some consideration or reflection on, oh, wow, and this is even a national priority for restoration versus one place maybe not being a national priority for restoration. That would be one factor weighing into those actual community level or regional level decisions. So yeah, I think that's my best answer, attempt at an answer for that question.
Gracias, Oscar. Siguen llegando las preguntas. Vamos a tomar
There are
unas
more and
cuantas
more
más.
questions.
Nos queda antes de la siguiente presentación de DISAN.
We will take some before
Nancy
this
Vargas
presentation.
dice,
Nancy Vargas
pueden
says,
definir
okay,
prioridades de
how can you
restauración
define restoration priorities without taking into account the social component?
In reality, you can't. But I think that this question is very similar to the previous question, with a very similar response. That these restoration maps, they are an output from the inputs that we gave them. So we did not give them a lot of social information. We did give them information about indigenous communities and some other information like that has a social component, poverty, but we did not really look at the social opportunities and social constraints, and therefore the resulting map is based on mostly on environmental priorities. But that's one of many things. Social priorities, social opportunities are others, economic priorities are other factors that have to be considered with the actual decision-making for restoration. So the process for deciding where restoration should actually occur, one of the inputs can be data-driven, environment-driven maps like we are producing here, but they need to go alongside discussions and decisions that incorporate social elements and economic elements. So we really we're careful never to pretend that we've considered thoroughly these other dimensions, and those must be considered through other processes, not data-driven processes and systematic conservation planning like we've done here. But that doesn't mean that this sort of information doesn't have value. We believe that this information is much more reliable than it's ever been in the past, and it brings important considerations to decision-making around environmental management.
Muchas gracias, Oscar. Tenemos
Thank you, Oscar. Okay, there is a comment supplementing what you said. Patricia Velasco says that the first approach is regional, but each ecosystem has ecological peculiarities, social dynamic peculiarities that should be taken into account. And there is also a question by Olga Leon. In a poor country such as Colombia, and given the social needs, the degradation and high costs of restoration efforts, how to select where to invest, what the country has planned for that 0.67% that you mentioned as scenario, as a landscape. Do we have to land realities? Olga Leon is asking.
Okay, thank you for the question. I think what you're highlighting is that there are often multiple things that we're trying to achieve from land management. So some of them might be ecological restoration, others might be food provision for local communities, others might be actual conversion into residential housing or agriculture. And often some of these land uses can be in conflict. So when we're thinking about something like ecological restoration, how can we find the best places to implement that restoration? So I think step one is you want to find places that are going to maximize the benefits. If you're going to be restoring places and not getting the most benefit, the most bang for your restoration buck, that's a lost opportunity. So I think an exercise like this, like the Humboldt work, to identify the places where benefits will be maximized, helps make sure that whatever you're able to restore, you get the most from. And then I think the next thing might be to actually explicitly consider some of those other land uses within the optimization. So actually consider agricultural opportunity cost, or actually consider human footprint in the optimization, so that you can find places for restoration where the benefits would be high, but the conflict or the cost to other land uses would be low. That was the last slide that I presented around bringing cost into the optimization, but we haven't yet done that. But that would be one way to make sure that you kind of minimize that conflict.
Muchas gracias, Oscar. Y Paola Isaacs, no sé si podrías abrir el micro para que...
Paola Isaacs, can you open up the microphone so you can explain to Oscar the last comment that you made or the question, while we wait to see if Paola is able to open up her mic. Paola, wonderful. This is much better, so you can explain your question in person directly to Oscar. Well, see, land tenancy or is an issue, especially in Andean territories, where areas are going to be more expensive, land ownership, that is. But there are other areas where there are poorities, and maybe their land ownership is an issue, or purchasing territory then can be problematic, because deforestation occurs, the land becomes more profitable or higher priced, and there's this balance, this lack of balance with regard to the cost of the land in the region. And authorities prefer not to purchase any land because it's very hard, and it's much responsibility, and this entails much responsibility on the part of the authorities. And many times there's a lack of forest or because people won't be able to plant, for example, and they want to plant through community gardens, for example. So the country needs, individuals need certain certifications, which is very hard to attain for a common farmer. So I just wanted to ask if there's a case that you've encountered where you need to overcome these issues with with regard to restoration, we always face this, where there are plants that we want, endemic plants that we want to propagate, but we don't have the right permits because the community becomes a bottleneck for us in a way. They hinder restoration. Have you ever encountered these types of obstacles? I was just curious.
Paola, I'm not sure if that was a question for me. If it was, for me, it's I haven't personally. The work that we're presenting here is kind of high level national strategic planning without that consideration of in the field working with local landholders and their opportunities and constraints. That's not a step that we've taken in this work. So I know yesterday you were presenting your strategic Humboldt strategic level work, but you were highlighting that you needed to still better coordinate with your on the ground teams that have the sort of experience of what does work where. So I would imagine that yourself as well as the ministry would be more of a leader on that front about where are the opportunities and constraints actually on the ground.
Muchas gracias, Oscar. Seguimos teniendo algunos comentarios.
Okay, thank you, Oscar. So we have more comments rather than questions, and we're gathering these questions. We have a question from Susana Rodriguez from the Humboldt Institute, and I'm going to ask her to open up the mic and perhaps just elaborate on her comment. Thank you, Cassandra. Well, it's a comment, not a question specifically. It has to do with the dilemma as to how to include certain criteria that you know are important when you ensure an action to be effective, and how to objectively decide where to focus our efforts. And Oscar explained very eloquently the fact that this exercise reflects is a reflection is more of an environmental reflection. Let me comment. See, these analytical exercises should be presented and imbued in exercises that already exist that are perhaps more complex, where the feasibility of implementation is considered on the one hand, and on the other hand, the exercise itself of prioritization. So this seems to be a photography where it's real time and you take a picture of what priorities are in real time. But I guess at a ministry level, we have to realize that these are dynamic processes, and in 4 years, we have to redo this and reprioritize and do this exercise once again. So my question, perhaps, Oscar, is, do we consider this process as a changing process, a dynamic one? What results from this exercise, from this, what is prioritized and is implemented in a period of time? Now, in the following iteration, is this going to be locked? Are we going to be able to lock these areas so we won't lose this first thrust of what has been done, and prioritize on what's been prioritized beforehand, perhaps? So specifically, Oscar, how are these exercises considered in a changing process in the future? And this is, as I mentioned, a single point in time. And I understand that this is a more complex project that has to be considered to be able to be effective. Does that make sense? Okay. Right. We're going to listen to your reaction to the comment.
Thank you for the comment, Susanna, and I think it reflects your experience over the years as you've been involved in so many of these spatial and strategic planning exercises, and you see them evolve through time. So I think that's a really important point, that we can't look at this exercise as being fixed forever. Really, it needs to be updated, and that updating can happen if it's going to be used to the best way that it could over time, it needs to be updated. And there's two reasons for the update. One is just better data or newer data, right? So that's just kind of a general bringing new data in. But I think the more important way for updating any of these types of analyses is as we learn about the system itself. What drives decision-making for restoration? Where is restoration most effective? Where are we learning that it's not effective? Where are we understanding where the greatest opportunities exist? So as we learn about that system from the kind of naive initial way we map priorities, we can start to bring in spatial data to reflect those new considerations. So one way that, an immediate update for us right here, we're discussing conflict with competing land uses and discussing costs. I think the next immediate way to update that priority map that I showed you would be to explicitly incorporate a measure of cost. So we can start to look for places which are going to have less conflict and less cost. Next logical places to update it, as we learn about the system, might simply be information around tenureship. Where are land tenures most suitable for restoration? That could be simply protected areas. This is places where you don't have legal limitations on restoration. You don't have to purchase the land. It's already mostly in government control, I believe. So, but some places within protected areas are degraded, right? So that might be a tenure which amplifies priorities for restoration. There might be requirements for companies that have tenures to restore some areas relative to offset areas that they've degraded. That might be information that could come in there, or information about communities' openness to restoration. So I think that's great, Suzanne. I would view what we've shown here as a good first step for identifying environmental priorities for restoration. But if, as the national policy for restoration evolves, if these strategic plans are going to help inform that policy, that the plans themselves need to evolve with that policy.
Muchas gracias, Oscar.
Okay,
Seguimos
thank
teniendo
you, Oscar. We continue to see more comments in the chat. We thank Adriana, Hugo, Paula, Francisco, Hernan, and Patricia. And these comments will be systematized and included as part of the first report of our workshop, including the Q&A session that will also be transcribed. Now, I don't want to take time away from the next presentation, and let me remind you that we will have more opportunities for dialogue and conversation. Thank you, Oscar, for your presentation again. And I'm sure, I hope that you'll be staying for the next few presentations. Now that we have a clear understanding of how to use systematic conservation planning in this project, we're going to now move on to the second part of the session, where we're going to focus on data sets, national data sets that are used for analyzing the restoration prioritization in Colombia. Now, it's important to emphasize that we focus on national data to be able to be more precise and relevant for Colombia. So I'm going to give the floor to Dai Zhang, my colleague, who's an expert in biodiversity and spatial planning from the UNDP Global Conservation Planning program. And she's going to speak about spatial data, the data used for this analysis. And then again, we'll hopefully have a dynamic session with her afterwards with your questions. Now, her national data analysis is based on the group clusters that we explained yesterday, that Paula Isaacs from the Humboldt Institute explained. It includes coverage in ecosystem services, coverage integrity, etc. So you have the floor, Dai.
Thank you, Cassandra. Hi, everyone. I am Di Zhang. It's my pleasure to be here and introduce the data structure of the restoration mapping process and the current national data we used to create the first iteration of restoration priority map that Oscar just showed in his presentation. And if I speak too fast, please help let me know. As Cassandra just introduced, it is important for us to focus on the spatial data we will be using in this mapping process to help the restoration mapping to more accurately reflect the priority areas for restoration and to help locate our actions further at regional level and local scale. So my introduction here is mainly to help you understand the data structure of this mapping process, what types of data we need, what are the national data we currently have and are using, and more importantly is to hear from your feedback in the next session. It's really exciting to see there are more than 80 experts join us today, and I love your feedback in the earlier session. So please keep your experts' opinions coming. And here I listed 3 aspects to help guide our discussion later. There are better national data to replace or improve the current layers we're using that I'll introduce later. And then are there additional data or aspects we should include in this mapping process and all the other suggestions you have to help us improve this work. With that, I want to start my presentation with an overview of the data structure. We can broadly break them down into 4 groups: base map, planning features, zones, and an optionally lock-in constraint. In today's discussion, our main focus will be the planning features. Each data group has slightly different requirements on the spatial data used. Here is a full list of data layers we used to create the first iteration of restoration map in Colombia. I know there's a lot of data listed in this slide, but we will go through them one by one later. And during my introduction, if you have any question for any specific data or comments, please feel free to share them in the chat. We will start with the base map or the planning units. The base map defines the range and scale of our planning area. Here we are doing a national level map, so we will use the national boundary of Colombia as the base map. And then the planning area will be divided into a set of discrete areas. In GIS term, it equals to pixels of a raster layer, where each unit can be independently calculated or selected. The size of the planning units are determined by multiple factors, such as the resolution of the input layer we gave it to it, and then the implementation needs of the country. In the current iteration of the restoration map, we used a 300 meter as the resolution for the map. This created a planning problem with 11 million independent planning units. This is a quite large number in the systematic conservation planning. In the next group, our main focus today is the planning features. These are data layers that can spatially identify restoration needs as well as multiple benefits. Here we're using the same data cluster as introduced by Humboldt yesterday to group these planning features into 3 categories: ecosystem diversity, land cover integrity, and ecosystem services. We will start with an introduction of layers in the ecosystem diversity cluster, and this includes the nationally identified important and representative ecosystems. to echo what Oscar just commented during the Q&A session, this include a mix of biome tags for the as country's priority to restore. And in this first data include the coverage of tropical Paramo ecosystem in Colombia, and then the national wetland ecosystem and the mangroves ecosystem. And for forest ecosystem, the tropical dry forest ecosystem was considered. These are national data provided by the Humboldt Institute during the ALSA project of Colombia. And next we have threatened ecosystems. This is the include a mixed type of different ecosystems that are defined according to IUCN's guidelines as red list terrestrial ecosystems. And they are either vulnerable, endangered, or critically endangered ecosystem identified in Colombia. And then we also have ecosystems that underrepresented by the conservation efforts. This is a composite layer incorporating the ecosystems in Colombia and the existing national protected areas. If the coverage of the protected areas within a certain ecosystem is under 30%, this ecosystem in this data will be considered as underrepresented. And the value assigned to each planning unit is the underprotected percentage of the areas within the overlapping ecosystems. So in the map on my slide, color. Sorry, is there any questions? If not, I will continue. So areas with a green or yellow color has highlighted the ecosystems that are underrepresented, at least underrepresented. And next, we have the wilderness area. This is to identify intact ecosystems and habitats with no human disturbance. And those are areas with a human footprint index value of 0. And then next couple layers are areas for species diversity and are areas important as important wildlife habitat. This include the key biodiversity areas. KBAs are internationally important areas for biodiversity, and they prioritized areas based on the vulnerability and uniqueness of wildlife species. And we also have a layer from Humboldt Institute on the corridors of connectivity between the national protected area of Colombia, as well as the threatened species richness and the endemic species richness. And you can see these species richness layer has strongly highlighted areas along the Andes Mountain and also covered part of the intact forest habitat in Colombia. Above are layers in the ecosystem diversity cluster. And with this information overlapped, it provides guidance on where the restore action could synergistically also benefit biodiversity. And next, we have planning features that are relevant with land cover integrity. First, we're looking at areas that are more frequently affected by floods, and that may need extra attention on land erosion and restoration efforts like reforestation. And then for the restoration mapping, we also need to know where are the areas currently in degradation. For this aspect, we included areas on soil degradation by salinization. And these are areas where soils tend to increase the concentration of soluble salts. And then we also have soil degradation by erosion. And the evaluation of the environment sensitivity over the country. These are national layers from the Institute of Hydrology, Metrology, and Environmental Studies. Areas in green and yellow color have highlighted area with higher environment sensitivity. And then there is also a national evaluation on the adaptation capacity to climate change at municipality level. The next data cluster is the ecosystem service. Starting with carbon, where the restoration action could have potential benefits to carbon and climate change mitigation, the relevant layers used here include biomass carbon and the soil carbon in the country. And then we used a layer about the projected carbon emission by future deforestation probability. This is a composite layer that has considered the probability of deforestation by 2050 based on a scenario from the year 2010 to 2015. And then we added the estimated carbon emission by combining the above ground biomass carbon and the soil carbon to create this layer. So areas highlighted in green and yellow color have higher risk in carbon emissions in the future, driven by the deforestation. And then there is also a global layer about the soil carbon sequestration. This is also a prediction of the potential increase in soil organic carbon in croplands after 20 years, following implementation of better land management practice under a high sequestration scenario. And this, as mentioned, this is a global layer. So here we are also looking for if there are any better national data on carbon sequestration and soil management that we can use to update this global version of the layer. And then there are 3 layers about ecosystem services in water, including the overall water demand in the country. The water demand here has combined demand from agricultural, mining, livestock sectors, as well as the domestic use of the water and the industry use of the water in Colombia. And then below the water demand layer is the water vulnerability layer in dry weather, estimated for the year 2010. And at the right side of the slide is a layer of the average water yield in the country. Then we also include socioeconomic aspects as the potential benefit of restoration. This was also mentioned by us during the Q&A session. So here we are looking at the poverty index in rural areas. This data is also at municipality level, provided by the National Statistics Department. And then we have included important areas of the Black community councils and indigenous reserve areas. And just echo to Fabio's comments earlier, the peasant, indigenous, and Afro-Colombian communities guarantee better care, management, and protection. These areas also often have greater conservation and restoration initiatives. So we want to make sure we can include those aspects in our restoration mapping. And then areas likely to be featured for family farming. And this is the part of the data in Oscar described as where the there might be conflict of land use, and we want to consider them into the mapping process. Like while we maximize the benefits of restoration, we also want to try to lower the existing conflicts in our restoration actions. And next layer is the area with invasive species. And this is the national data from Humboldt Institute that combined 24 potential distribution of the invasive species overall the country. Our last planning feature is a proxy of the pollination ecosystem services. And this data has considered the distribution of 5 pollinator species as the service provider, and then crop suitability map as the service user. So above is an overview of the current planning feature we used in the first iteration of restoration mapping. The point here is really just to give you introduction and to collect your expert opinions on how we can update and improve the current layer used. What are the gaps there that we should add to the mapping process? And the planning feature data will provide a basis or input information to guide the selection of restoration priorities in our planning scenario. And next, I also want to briefly introduce the other types of data in the mapping analysis, including zones and the logging constraints. Oscar had just had a very detailed introduction of the zones, so I'll just be brief here. Zones here is used as spatial hard constraint for the mapping analysis to only select restoration priority areas within the zones defined. So currently we are using the landscape integrity layer introduced by Humboldt yesterday, and we are including areas that have low or very low integrity as the zones to determine areas suitable for restoration. And the last data type is called the lock-in constraint. By selecting an area to lock in, it ensures that the final restoration map will include these areas, will fully include the area being locked in. For example, if there are areas already in National Restoration Agreement and should be fully reflected on the final restoration map, we can choose to lock in them as part of the lock-in features. And in the current iteration of the restoration map, we have locked in the restoration registry, which takes about 2% of the country. And above are the spatial data we used. I hope this helps you understand the overall data structure, the types of data that might be useful in the mapping process. Now, let me review again the 3 questions from the beginning of my presentation. Please also start to think about these during our short break, and we'll come back with a discussion on, are there any better national data to replace or improve the data I mentioned above? Are there additional aspects and existing available spatial data that we can include in this mapping process to improve our work, and any other suggestions you think that might be helpful? And I hope this could help guide our discussion. I'm sure we will receive a lot of important and useful information from you. All right, and I will be here to help answer your questions. I think Oscar is still here, and he can also share more of his vision of this mapping process. And with that, thank you again, and special thanks to my colleague Scott Atkinson, who's doing a lot of the mapping work, but due to the time zone, he's sleeping right now. And over to you, Cassandra. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Di, por tu exposición.
Thank you, Di, for your presentation. After a break, we will do this exercise. We will be able to identify by each one of the data layers presented by Dean if there were a better layer representing what we want to analyze depending on the clusters. And if there is new data, updated data, or further comments that you can have about the data, they are welcome. So let's keep that for the next session. If there were any questions or comments about the methodology and the initial context explained by Dee, of course, you can open your mics or you can write in the chat. After the break, we can engage in this Q&A session. So, once again, okay, Susana Rodriguez says, the zone layer, can it be also revised?
Yes, the zones can be revised. And also, like what I presented, it's currently the low and very low integrity area in the landscape integrity layer, but we can also add more aspects from your suggestions. Yeah.
Claro que sí. Entonces, Susana, guardemos esto para la sesión.
So, Susana, we will follow up on this during the feedback session. So let's take 10 minutes. It's 10:30. Yes, we will discuss this all together in the session where we will revise each one of the data layers. So it's 10:30 in Colombia. We'll be back at 10:40. Okay.
Listo, estamos todas y todos de regreso como en el teatro.
We're
Primera
back,
llamada,
just like the
segunda
theaters,
llamada,
first
ya
call,
está,
second call.
reconectamos.
So let's all reconnect.
Listo, ahí ya veo a varios
I see
conectados
many
nuevamente, las
connected
reacciones,
once again,
de que ya
and
están aquí
emojis
con,
just stating
tomando un
that
café en
everyone
mano,
is ready.
relajados y luego de haber estirado
Hopefully,
las piernas
you
por
had a
las
cup
que
of
les
coffee,
recomiendo que
stretched out your
utilicen
legs, and
ahora
are
para
ready for the
relajarse.
next
Entonces,
part
ahora
of
vamos
our
a hacer un
meeting.
ejercicio interactivo.
So we're now going to hold a more,
Disculpa, Ricardo Rivera, sí,
sorry,
tienes un
Ricardo
punto. Ah,
Rivera,
no, era
do you have a
Wilfredo,
question?
parece que
Oh
ya
no, it was a
está aquí con
reaction
nosotros. Perfecto, gracias,
that
Ricardo.
he's here with us.
Entonces,
Okay.
para este ejercicio interactivo,
So for the
me
final interactive
gustaría
exercise,
comentarles un poco en qué va a tratar. Vamos a utilizar como punto de
I just wanted to mention
partida
that we're going to
la lista
use
de
the
datos espaciales
data
que bien
list
explicó Di en su
as
presentación.
Di explained
Para
in her
ello vamos a
presentation,
contar con una
and we're
tabla
going
que
to,
resume estos datos. Mi colega Marión está
Marianne
compartiendo
is
en estos
sharing
instantes el link de
the
acceso
link
a
right
esta
now to be able
tabla
to access this
en
table.
donde todos ustedes van a poder ver que
And you will
están
all be able
organizados
to
también
see
por los
that it's
clústeres
organized by clusters
empleados por el Instituto Humboldt.
explained by the
Me
Humboldt
menciona
Institute.
que Luis Alberto no escucha, pero creo que
No,
el resto sí está escuchando bien.
let's
Liliana, si
see,
me
Luis
puedes hacer el
Alberto,
gesto, sí. Quizá Luis
1 second.
Alberto
Uh,
salir y
Luis
volver
Alberto,
antes
maybe
de
you
la,
have
de
to
la
exit the
sesión.
meeting and enter
Si alguien
once
está,
again.
Liliana, ¿le puedes dar esa indicación, por favor?
If someone
Perfecto, si
could
no
give
sería
him
Luis
that
Alberto.
indication.
Entonces, los datos están organizados
So
por
data
clústeres explicados
is
por el
organized
Instituto
by
Humboldt. Tenemos
clusters.
así que en
And
diversidad en ecosistemas hay
we have
una
for
serie de capas
ecosystems,
de datos
diversity in
y
ecosystems, a
ustedes pueden
series of
visualizar, si
data.
alguien me puede ayudar a compartir la pantalla, perfecto. Entonces, aquí ustedes pueden visualizar que está por
And
temas,
you
es
will be
decir,
able to see that it's
¿no?
according to, the clusters are
Para
organized according to
definir.
topic.
De ahí en la columna C tienen el nombre de la
And
capa,
column C shows the name
una
of the layer
la fuente de datos,
and the
¿no? Y
data
después si vamos
source.
avanzando por cada una de esas líneas,
And if
ustedes van
we
a tener
move
la
over
opción de
to the
darnos
right,
su
we will
retroalimentación y
see
pueden
that
poner,
there is
por
a
ejemplo,
space for
datos
you to
personales
include
para
your
sustituir la capa
comments or feedback.
actualizada o
So
sugerir
national or
también
national data
nuevos
showing
datos,
what can replace
así como
that,
la
or
fuente
new
que
data,
vamos a
as
contactar
well
u
as
otros
the source of data that we
comentarios,
need to
como por ejemplo estos
contact
últimos que nos señalaba
and
Rosana, que vamos a ver
comments.
dónde los colocamos. Como ustedes pueden ver, el documento
So as you
tiene
can
para
see,
todos los
the
participantes
document
la opción solo de
includes
visualizar,
the
porque
option
somos una
only of
montón de personas compartiendo al
visualizing
tiempo con el
the
documento.
table.
Pero tanto mi colega Liliana como
But
yo
my
vamos a ir
colleague
tomando nota
Liliana
de
and
lo
myself
que
will take
ustedes
note
vayan
of
dando
your
como
comments,
retroalimentación.
of your
Así
feedback,
que
and we
podemos
will
hacer
add
este
that.
ejercicio en orden. Vamos a ir
So
viendo
we can
cada uno de los nombres de
look
las
at each
capas
of the
y
names of the
tomando
layers
nota de sus
and
sugerencias.
take
Las
note
pueden
of your
hacer levantando
suggestions.
la mano
So you
y
can
nos
raise
piden
your
la opción
hand
de abrir el micro,
and I will give you the
o
option
pueden
of
escribirlo
opening the
en
mic,
el chat.
or you can jot
Al
that
finalizar
down
todas las capas,
in
por ejemplo,
the
en diversidad de
chat.
ecosistemas,
At
podemos
the
mostrar
end
que hay
of the layers
ustedes
for
sugieren faltantes,
ecosystem
¿no? Por ejemplo,
diversity,
ven que hay
you can
filas
add any
vacías, ¿no? La fila que está vacía,
additional
entonces se pueden agregar aún más y
layers
lo vamos a ir colocando.
or
Tenemos aproximadamente una hora para
or
este ejercicio, así
and we
que
have an hour for
creo que
this.
es suficiente
So I
tiempo
think
para
it is
poder
plenty of time to be able to
revisarlo y tener un ejercicio
review and
bastante fructífero.
be able to
Al mismo tiempo puede
have
haber
a
espacio para
enriching
algunos
discussion.
comentarios generales.
And we
Entonces
also have time for
empecemos.
general comments
Vamos
as well.
viendo
So
cómo
let's begin.
funciona la maquinaria, ¿no? Cómo corre y
Let's
viendo qué necesitemos ajustar.
see what
Entonces
needs we need to
empezamos
make
con
or what adjustments we need to
el
make.
clúster de diversidad en
So let's begin
ecosistemas
with the
con
ecosystem
el nombre de
diversity
la capa.
cluster and
Sí,
the
sí,
name of the
Daniela, te
layer.
comenté. Ninguno puede editar el
Now,
documento
remember,
porque
none of
son
you can edit
82
the
personas
document. If not, it
las
would
personas
be
conectadas
chaotic for
simultáneamente
82
a la vez.
people to edit the
Déjame
document
verificar.
at the
Yo
same
voy a
time.
ir
So
mencionando
I will be
cada uno
the
de
reporter,
de
for
las
example. I'll
capas y
mention the names
ustedes
of the
me dicen
layers
si
and you can
corresponden,
comment.
si es que
And
hay
if
capas que puedan
there are
sustituir la capa
additional
actual
layers that
o
can
sugerencia de
substitute
un nuevo
this
dato
current
o algún
layer
comentario
or a new
que tengas al
or new data
respecto,
or comment
ya
that
sea
you may
levantando
have.
la mano para abrir el micro o
So raise your
comentando,
hand to
¿no?
open the mic
Entonces,
and open the mic, or just jot that down in the chat. So these are layers that are duplicated. And we can always, if there are layers that are duplicated, we can also jot that down as well. So let us know if for Paramos there's a comment. This is by the this was provided by the Humboldt Institute 2015. Can this be substituted, or is there something else that we knew, a new layer that we need to add? So if you agree, maybe you can just give us a thumbs up or an emoji. Paola perhaps can also comment. Tell us if that's correct. So we can move to the next. I think the three that you mentioned and wetlands are fine. Okay, so let me just jot this down. Continue with your comments and suggestions, please. Tell us if there's other data that we need to add that will help us in our analysis. We need to, so let's continue forward to mangrove ecosystem coverage. Susanna. See, I understand that you want to use layers, but I'm not sure if what are the consequences of including layers of what's mapped only? For example, natural savannas isn't included. So isn't it going to be impacted negatively? We could say it's going to be ignored. And should we leave the threatened ecosystem map as is, or should we make a separate map? Okay, so let me ask Daya what she thinks should be done. It was just a comment. There wasn't a specific question. So perhaps we can ask for a specific question, Dai. Okay, what is the consequence? Okay, Dai, Susanna can ask the question once again if.
That's okay. Sorry. So I think we can include all the important features that we think are useful for the data to consider. So there will be two ways to highlight the ecosystem that we really value. One is to mark them as a single layer for the prioritize our tool to consider. But we can also raise the value of the layer that has that ecosystem or that environmental information to increase its potential representative in the final map. So yeah, I think if there are ecosystem you want to highlight in the mapping process, we can also add them as a single layer. If they will still be kept in the threatened ecosystem, then there will kind of like be two layers of that ecosystem being considered in the process that will increase the weight even more to increase its representation.
I'm sorry, Dai, can you just repeat that last part, the second? Oh.
Tener un ecosistema explícitamente mapeado.
Sorry, Thais.
Sorry, is that ecosystem going to be penalized, or is it going to be offset?
Nuevamente, si podrían, ya, gracias, sí, si le podrías otra vez transmitir
Okay, we're just going to repeat the comment one more time so it'll be clear, Dai.
Pero ella ya respondió, Cassandra.
Sí, no, tú le acabas de comentar algo en español.
Okay, you just mentioned something in Spanish that didn't reach Dai because the interpreter was on the wrong channel. I apologize for that, Dai. So my interpretation is, are you going to punish, let's say, those ecosystems that aren't explicitly mapped?
There will not be a punishing score on the layer that's mapped or has a value. So we have standardized all the layer to a value range of 0 to 1. If they have the planning units has a value larger than 0, it will be a positive input for the map to consider when it's selecting the planning units. For example, some ecosystem may have a representation of 0.5 in one planning unit, and there are some other ecosystem have a value of 1. When the map select the planning units, they will prioritize the units with higher value. I'm not sure if I understand clearly. And Oscar, please feel free to jump in.
Yeah, I might add a little bit. So Susanna, we have, say about a couple dozen layers here, each highlighting various environmental values. So right now we're discussing the kind of measures at the ecosystem level. And the ecosystems that are showing up here are ones that through the ALSA process were identified as the most important ecosystems, ones that we want to make sure that we highlighted. So we see Paramos here for their biological and water service values and the uniqueness of the ecosystem. So they're getting highlighted in this part of the layers. Now, so savanna ecosystems weren't identified as something that needed to come in here. However, they're not directly penalized, nor are they ignored. So in the other layers lower down, where we could see things like endemic species or threatened ecosystems or potential carbon sequestration or role in connectivity between protected areas, these other ecosystems can their values can be highlighted through those other layers. So whenever we're looking at a particular priority, if it's particular layer, let's say it's carbon, high carbon ecosystems, that doesn't mean that low carbon that low carbon ecosystems are going to be ignored. Their values are going to be picked up in other places using other data sets. So I think that applies for this ecosystem. This kind of ecosystem area that we're talking about now. However, if there's some ecosystems that are national priorities that are not showing up here from the ALSA work, we could add those as well explicitly, in addition to how they're considered in some of the other layers. The other way that we can do this, Susanna, is that you mentioned the ecosystem or biome specific targets for restoration. Instead of being a national area-based target, we could make the targets need to come down to the ecosystem or biome level and ensure that restoration is then spread across biomes. I'm not sure, Susanna, if you feel that that's what Dee said, what I've said has kind of covered your, I'd say, concern here.
Yeah,
Sí, Susana tiene la mano levantada. Sí, Susana, te escuchamos.
No, que entiendo por qué
I
están ahí.
understand why they're there, because they're we're only mapping strategic ecosystems. But again, my concern is that what happens, we want to guarantee that ecosystems are going to be restoration ecosystem or ecosystems that we need to restore are going to be represented, because I think they're biased in these layers, that is, into forestry aspects. I think that we need to prioritize areas based on ecosystems, because we're considering, for example, the absolute state of the ecosystem without considering other ecosystems and how they interact. And then are we guaranteeing that they're going to be, that these other ecosystems are going to be addressed? And I understand what you're saying at the beginning about the 30% that isn't explicitly
pues que no hay, digamos, una definición de cómo
defined as to how to
pero si pensamos
execute that.
que en
But if
Colombia
we
tenemos
think
una
that in Colombia we
variedad
have
de
a great,
estados de
a
ecosistemas
high variability
ecosistemas que
in
están en
our
muy buenas
ecosystems
condiciones,
that are in a
bosques
good
tropicales,
condition, such
bosques
as tropical
amazónicos,
forests along the
ecosistemas que están
Chocó
muy
or
bien
Amazon,
y
or
ecosistemas
those
de
that
los que
are
tenemos
doing
muy poca
poorly, or
información.
those that we have very little
Me
information
parece
about. I think
un poco
that
desbalanceado
it's not
ponerlos a
being
todos en un mismo
we're
ecosistema en
unbalancing
ese sentido.
this whole map.
Mi
We're not
recomendación,
reflecting the reality
pero
with
pues por supuesto
with this
para
map.
que lo evalúen
That
desde el
is,
equipo científico,
it's just for you to assess.
hacer
And I think
investigaciones
that
por
perhaps you should
ecosistema.
prioritize based on
Y
ecosystems.
esto garantizaría, por
And
ejemplo,
this would
que
ensure
podamos trabajar en
that we
páramos
can
con el
work
estado
uh,
relativo de
with
todos los páramos del
the
país y
paramos, for example,
priorizar
with
los
all the
donde
paramos in
podemos
the country and prioritize
podemos
where
trabajar
paramos
los
need to be
desechos
restored. We
de
can work
forma
on dry forests in
regional,
the same manner,
pero sin embargo
wetlands. And for
tenemos que
those that we have no
trabajar
information about,
ecosistemas
we have
amenazados,
the threatened
lo que está
ecosystem map
diciendo
that
en
is
términos
telling us
comparativos con el
in
resto del país
relative
cómo
terms
están
to this
las
ecosystem how
cifras
these areas are
de ese
doing
ecosistema a nivel
within
nacional.
this ecosystem in a on a
Esta
national
sería mi
level. So that
recomendación
would be my recommendation, to be more inclusive and
para esta
representative
fase de
for this
incorporar
first
ecosistemas.
phase where we're
Ya el
including
resto, si es
ecosystems.
un mismo
The
resumen de
rest
todos, diversidad,
does make
riqueza,
sense: diversity,
biodiversificación,
wealth, endemic
pero
species,
bueno,
etc.
lo
But
más
just to
justo
be a little bit
en
more
términos de lo que
fair
requiere
in
ambos
terms of what we
ecosistemas.
want to cover
No sé qué
in
pensamos
with
de
regard
esto.
to restoration. I'm not sure what everyone else
No sé,
thinks.
Oscar o Dee, si
Um,
tuviéramos alguna
Di,
reacción.
Oscar, what do you think?
I think what I'm hearing here makes a lot of sense in terms of bringing the national restoration target down to the ecosystem level. I think even if it's not in the global guidance or the target, ultimately Colombia will get to decide how it implements and thinks about restoration. And what I'm hearing is that Colombia is quite interesting in terms of how starkly its ecosystems differentiate. They're almost entirely different systems. The coast, up in the Andes, down in the Amazon. So what I think we should do for the final iteration is to actually break the target down to the ecosystem level and make sure that all ecosystems are represented by the 0.67% national target and the global 30% target. I think it's too. I don't think we want to play with representation, ensuring representation at the planning unit, at the planning feature layer, like all the data that Dee's showing right now. There's a reason why these have been selected, and trying to play with them to make sure that every ecosystem gets represented, I think would be too manipulative of the data itself. I think it'd be better to just at the target level make sure that each ecosystem gets represented. Technically, it's quite difficult to implement it with the maximum coverage problem, but we'll be able to find a workaround within the tool. Thanks for the
Muchas
comments, Susanna.
gracias, Oscar. Y Di, yo quería
Thanks,
preguntarte,
Oscar. I wanted to ask you, now that we have comments in the chat, if perhaps we should add in there in line 14, Savannah, which is a system that hasn't been included, savannas and Andean forest, or do you think we should add it as general comments? You guide me, and then I'll give the floor to a participant that has his hand raised.
Yeah, I think for the savanna, that's not well represented in the current data features. You can add them as a new layer, and would be great if we can also identify the available source, like which institute or ministry are able to provide us this data. This kind of information will also be very helpful for us to collect the new data and integrate into our next iteration. Thank you.
Gracias, Di. Entonces, ahí eso nos comenta
Okay,
Susana.
Dee, Susanna says that we don't have a map for savannas. That's the problem. Perhaps someone else who is attending this session that has made a comment can perhaps comment on that. Paola visualize or make savannas more visible, if you could tell us where we could obtain a data source. If you can comment on that in the chat. Because to add this, we definitely do need a source to attribute credibility to it. So place that in the chat, please. Olga says that close to the savanna, we could obtain that from the continental ecosystems map, that we can place that as a comment, Liliana, as information, as a suggestion for new data, right? That would be in that same column. So this is, of course, subject to review. And the same goes for Andean forest that Ricardo Rivera has mentioned in the chat. If you could also tell us what source can provide or can be provided for this. And then we can continue to move forward in the order we had mentioned. I no longer see a raised hand by Luis Alberto. Do you have a comment, Luis Alberto, or has this been resolved with the last conversations? Can you react? Luis Alberto, go ahead. I just have a quick question. And regarding the ecosystems, see, there are ecosystems that have deteriorated because of the human footprint. And these ecosystems are susceptible with regard that they can't be restored because we have to meet unmet needs for individuals living there. So we would like to be able to elaborate a proposal that we could present to governments in charge of these areas. And I'm referring to producers or inhabitants near the Amazon, sorry. They've arrived from other territories in the country fleeing violence. They reached these lands, deteriorated, and they try to improve their livelihood, and they impact the ecosystem. There's a possibility of restoring it, but they need to improve their socioeconomic conditions, however, before they restore the ecosystem. And there are other ecosystems that have been disturbed and that have been abandoned by inhabitants. So this could also be included, perhaps. What are the ecosystems that are partially deteriorated or are significantly deteriorated and are still inhabited? Because we're not sure if a population group is going to be able to contribute to restoration if their socioeconomic needs aren't met. So these are things that have to be considered, not so much to develop them, but to just take them as, propose them to the government as a possibility.
Gracias, Luis Alberto, por el comentario más que una pregunta, ¿no? Le estamos tomando nota para el análisis y también creo que es de bastante
So we take note for the analysis. It's quite interesting for the Environment Ministry in order to produce the National Restoration Strategy. Therefore, we have the layer to move on, that is ecosystem mangler cover from the Institute of Marine Studies and Coastal Studies. Do you have national data or information to replace this layer? For manglers, you can consult the updated mangler coverage. So Liliana, please, you can fill in the field with the link.
Y eso lo colocamos perfecto, Inbemar, sí, justo, Catalina nos acompaña de Inbemar.
Catalina is here with us from Indemar.
No sé si hubiera algún otro comentario.
Any comments? Any further comments? Yes, Zoraida says that there is a data layer that we had to consider from 2021.
Gracias. Listo, entonces
Thank
vamos
you.
avanzando al siguiente, ecosistemas
So,
amenazados. Es éter
threatened
al
ecosystems,
2017, si es que les parece que es correcta la capa de
2017.
o si tenemos alguna más actualizada
Is it
o algunos datos
correct?
que podamos usar
Or
para reflejar los ecosistemas
do
amenazados.
we have a more updated layer?
Gracias, María Jimena, por el comentario.
Thank you, Maria Jimena, for your comment.
Espérenme, estamos leyendo lo que nos dicen. El ministerio cuenta con la capa de
The
humedales hasta el
ministry
2020. Entonces, Claudia,
has the
nos
wetlands
que puede servir para la capa en la que
layer
estamos
by
o para
2020. Is it useful for this layer or for which one?
No, para la anterior, para el
para la anterior.
For the
proceso
previous
exacto,
one.
en la de humedales,
Yes.
exacto. Sí.
Humedales, ya. Sí, es que como yo estoy
Yes.
avanzando, ahí
disculpa.
sí, no te preocupes, pero si me ayuda a poner las humedales primero, listo, ya.
So wetlands first.
Ahí está
Okay.
la de
Very
sierra,
well.
listo, de acuerdo con Susana.
According to Susana,
Ujú. Claro que sí. Paola y Susana, en eso estamos de acuerdo. Después va a haber un
then there will be,
estudio posterior
yes,
de priorización. Por ahora estamos
a
mapeando
priority
todas las capas de datos existentes
analysis.
en
Now we are
este
mapping all the
equipo
existing
del
layers
Instituto Humboldt, ¿no?
according to the Humboldt Institute studies. So threatened ecosystems.
Ajá. Este comentario de Susana sobre la capa éter podría ir
This comment about the ether layer,
podemos colocar como otro
we can
comentario
put as
posterior
other comments,
para el
right?
análisis. Ujú. Diego, nos mencionas que para humedales está
So
la
for
capa
wetlands,
D3,
you have the D3 layer, right?
Comentarnos al respecto. No es entonces la de humedales 2020, sino es otra que podemos considerar.
It's not
Podríamos
2020
colocarlo,
wetlands.
opción 3,
Is there
adicionales a la del 2020, si pudiéramos
another one
desear
other than the
comentarnos.
2021?
Sí, ya confirmo si es la misma o hay una más actualizada.
Yes.
Si está la versión 3, que es la última, que tiene
Hola,
la dirección de
Hello. Yes.
Perfecto.
buenos días.
Sí, Álvaro. Sí,
Yes,
La
Alvaro.
dirección de bosque, yo les confirmo la capa.
Yes, I confirm
perfecto.
the layer.
Humedales 2020,
There is one 2020 wetlands version 3.
de diciembre, entonces
Ujú.
esa es la última. Si quieren
That's the
les
last
comparto
one.
el enlace
Pero eso
para
sería
I
que
can
puedan
put
checar.
the,
Vale.
yes, I can put here the link.
ahí nos van a copiar el link
Yes, they
Liliana,
will
para
copy the link,
entonces
Liliana.
en ecosistemas
So under
amenazados,
ecosystems, threatened ecosystems,
como bien dice
the
Susana,
consensus is key.
le vamos poniendo el ok. Después tenemos en representatividad de los ecosistemas, de la subdirección de ecosistemas e información
We have
ambiental.
environmental information.
Sí, Susana, lo que podemos hacer es que en este momento el equipo
At this point in time, the team that is with me here, the technical team, can share in the chat this presentation in PDF so that you can review the detail of each one of the data layers.
Me van a apoyar con eso. Gracias, Susana. Excelente sugerencia. Tienes toda la razón. Vamos perfeccionando el ejercicio. Es la primera vez que hacemos este ejercicio.
This is the first exercise. The time of the first exercise is the first workshop, and Colombia is the pioneer in this one. Okay. It had to do more from the management side of what's being declared as protected areas. So I was talking about an exercise to recognize significant sites. But that declaration is part of another exercise, like the management of that input. It could be included in ecosystem layers. So if not represented, there is some degree of intervention, and that's why we are prioritizing this for conservation rather than restoration. And there will be an exercise on prioritizing the data described here. As Dee very well said, in the second tab of this Excel sheet that you received, you also have access to the description of the layer. However, the team will be copying the presentation in PDF. That will be very, very useful. So in the second tab, you can see this description of the data. Okay, the second column is in Spanish. You have access then to both languages. Now, let's go to the first tab. The team is going to share with you this presentation in PDF. Now, thank you, Álvaro. That link shared by Álvaro is for the wetland layer. And now, let's move on. Paula, have you raised your hand again? Okay. Thank you, Paula. So, representation of ecosystems. There is no update comment for this layer. Now, the wild layer. From the Humboldt Institute. Any comments on how to update that? I don't know that, Paula says, but perhaps somebody from the Humboldt Institute does. Wilderness, line 8. There seems to be no need to replace anything in this layer. Here's the link copied on tropical dry forest. And this has to be inserted as a comment. The wild layers is derived from the human footprint so that we can correlate that and compare that in due time. Now, next layer. Important biodiversity areas, key biodiversity areas, KBAs, and AICAs. The data source is 2023. Yes, okay, we will copy that as a comment, yes, for the wilderness layer. And KBAs and AICAs, any comments? Could this be replaced or supplemented with more data? Otherwise, we moved on to the next one, connectivity. We use the Humboldt Institute layer. This is a collective exercise. It's like an overview. And then we will contact each one of the institutions. So we will need Liliana's participation that will establish the data connection with you for revision, updating, and collection of this data. That is the starting point. That's why the exercise is fast in order to go through all the existing data layers. Yes, Paola. And the question is, there is a connectivity area between protected areas. Why is it that we have a connectivity? There is a more updated one that is with all the natural covers. So that would be more appropriate to include. So how would we include this? Update the current layer. But how update it by 2020? Yes, 2020. With the Humboldt Institute. And we can check that with Susana, okay? Connectivity layer. Connectivity layer between natural areas from 2020, right? It's more recent. Thank you, Liliana, for taking note. Perhaps we can put that, Liliana, as a comment, right? To guide the search later. And then threatened species richness. If the data layer used from 2018 is okay from Humboldt, or if we have to update that. There is a more recent one, I think. Yes. The same for endemic species? Yes, for the three of them. So, for threatened species, biomodels. The same applies to endemic species, biomodels, to review that with Elkin Noguera. And also for endemic species or only for threatened species richness? For the three. And the other one worthwhile reviewing because we have presence of invading species, right? That would be like another layer. And that is key for restoration purposes, yes. So this is the end of the revision of the layer of ecosystem clusters. Are there any other layers that we should include in this cluster? Consider Ramsar sites. This cluster is the diversity in ecosystems. Are there any comments about this, considering the Ramsar sites? D, are you connected? Claudia from UNTP Colombia said that we could consider the Ramsar sites to include that as a layer. Have you assessed that? Or you think we should add it here as a new layer to investigate?
May I ask Oscar's opinion on adding the Ramsar site? I know we have a global layer on the Ramsar site, and would be great if there's still national data on that.
Yeah, I don't see any reason not to. We've certainly done it for other countries. Right now we have a wetlands layer, national wetlands layer that we're using, which would be similar to the Ramsar sites. I can't remember our decision not to use Ramsar in the ALSA process, but if it's being flagged here as an important layer and the data are available, I think it would be a good addition, yes.
Perfecto, ahí nos comenta Susana que habría que
Susana says that we should assess if the Ramsar sites are already part of in the KBIs. We have to cross that information in the KBAs. If they are part of the KBAs, you can add that to line 17 and the link being copied by Álvaro of the Ramsar sites. National data to replace the current layer. Yes, in that column, correct. Then we had the comment made by Celine of mangroves. Yes, mangroves are included. Celine, do you want to say anything else about this? I'm not sure what you mean by your comment, because cover of the mangrove ecosystem is already included. So yes, it was that. So everything seems to be that, okay, we can go back and review something that we want to add to diversity of ecosystems. This is the starting point of a revision process that will be led with and in permanent contact with national institutions. And Liliana, it's not the only time we will review this, but we can move on to coverage integrity or landscape integrity. You have the wetland layer and Ramsar sites. So perhaps, so landscape integrity. The first column is soil susceptibility to flooding. 2010 from the IDEAM 2010. Why is this related to landscape integrity? D, perhaps could you explain why is it that you consider the soil susceptibility to floods in the cluster of landscape integrity?
I would like to invite Oscar to jump in, but I think this cluster, the layers in this cluster was also built up on the ALSA analysis before. And here are layers that we want to highlight as lands in degradation, and we need to, highly sensitive areas or areas with more flood risk that we need to emphasize the restoration efforts. Oscar, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Dee. I think you handled it well there. I'll just add that sometimes these clusters, there's overlap between one and another, and it can be hard to determine where exactly a layer should go. In terms of soil susceptibility to flooding, that can be linked to the condition of the soil. and therefore the kind of land cover integrity. Has the soil been compacted, vegetation removed? These are both things that can enhance overland flow and flooding and are related to land cover. So for these reasons, we've put it in within this cluster of land cover integrity, but it could go elsewhere if it's felt it's a better fit in one of the other clusters. To be honest, for the optimization, the clusters are not considered actually in the optimization. They're really just a grouping mechanism for us to be able to show how layers feed back through these clusters. But when the optimization is run to identify priority areas, whether a layer is in one cluster or another isn't a major factor.
Gracias a Oscar y Dee. Entonces
Okay,
aquí
thanks
Paola
both Di and Oscar. Paola is suggesting here
nos sugiere acerca de faltaría una capa de
that
cobertura como
fact that
tal, y
we're
Paola
lacking
decía
a coverage
en fila 23
layer.
cobertura.
And if I add
¿Tienes
in row
fuente
23
de
coverage,
datos?
do you have the data source for that? Well, there's the 2018 land cover report, but perhaps this may be outdated. We would have to corroborate that to make sure we can use that or maybe something more updated. But see, we have to, I'm just saying that we can't just say forest, no forest. We have to look at the subtleties. So I think that there may be an updated layer. Okay, Susanna. So you're saying that this has been resolved by Oscar with regard to how relevant the clusters are and how they impact the prioritization exercise. So Paola's stating that we would miss the organic soil layer. So perhaps can we use this? What is the source? That's a map from the Geographic Institute. What's the year? 2018, I believe. Okay, so once again, let me just reiterate. So I think that it would be important to know if these areas that are susceptible to flooding, despite their cluster being included in a cluster or not, you want to know if they would be included in an analysis. So I'm going to ask, is this going to be included in the analysis? Is that it? Well, basically, it's assessing what assumptions exist with regard to that layer. Now, I'm not saying that integrity is being assessed, but within the different, the normal dynamics of Colombia water systems, what areas are going to experience flooding and which ones are not. Because many times infrastructure is built or buildings are built on the edge of flood sites or possible flood sites. So I believe it could also reflect the following areas where we want to restore rivers and where we want flooding. So I don't know if it's a layer that includes many assumptions with regards to integrity. So I'm not sure if it's even worth considering or not. But I think we have to look at the layer in detail, in greater detail. And I'm not really aware I'm not really updated on that. Well, because I've compared both, and I know that it's not updated because there are different flooding periods that are longer periods of flooding, and they coincide with the wetlands. So I'm not sure if this is in the right place, if this is tied with coverage rather than flood area. Okay, I'm taking note of what is being said. So the team can then assess your comments and then get back to you on that. And we can discuss that in greater detail. Okay, Lena is the contact for the deforestation and forest layer that's in line 25. So the EDM data is being included here. And we're placing the Geographic Institute where organic carbon and soil, and then flooding. So let's go back to the layer on row 19, which is sensitivity to the soil to salinity. I would add that there's a map that was a layer that was updated for San Andres and Providencia. Okay, so can we add that as a comment? Degradation of soil due to erosion. Can you confirm that that's the most current source, the one that dates back to 2012? (2015), I see that's being mentioned, susceptibility of soil, but that dates back to 2015, not 2016. But soil degradation, can you confirm that the info is correct, that it dates back to 2012? Soil degradation due to erosion for organic carbon in soil. That goes back to the Geographic Institute 2017. Wait, Olga, you're saying that it's more recent. Okay, soil degradation by erosion. What date does that stem back to? The most recent source, just to make that correction, 2015. Okay, so let's consider 2015. Let's include that. Rather than correcting the number, we're going to add it as a comment that it dates back to 2015, source IDEAM. So then we go to line 21, which is the NEO environmental index. It says 2010. So it includes degradation. So in line 21, we have the environmental sensibility index. Is that the most updated version? Or the most updated data that we have, 2010? And also assess its pertinence. So let's just state that as a document, assess its pertinence. And if it's, and that is if the prior data has been included. So it's the organic carbon stock in soil. That's line 24. Okay. There's a comment with the explanation from that explains that layer. Thank you. We can also update the lower, okay, line 24 is going to be updated as a result of that source. So capacity for climate adaptation. says here. Let me just make sure that the interpretation or the translation is correct. Climate adaptation capacity. And that's from the IDEAM 2010. Can you confirm, Olga, that that's correct? Should it be the data be more current? How long have we had that layer for? Well, I think we need to look into that. I'm not really sure what the data includes, but we will look into it, as I said. Or if there's another data set that can replace that, that could also be a consideration. Okay, I am copying Susana's comments to include the climate change vulnerability layer. And I'm commenting here that it has to be reviewed. So the remaining layers are new layers suggested in this exercise. Are there any other data layers or data sets that you consider important to add with regard to coverage integrity? If not, we could move on to ecosystem services. I know that Oscar's group has used the fragmentation layer. Now, I'm not sure if they used it for human footprint, but I think human footprint is also important to mention with regard to integrity, soil integrity. Okay, so let me add human footprint as a row. Can you help me add that? And could you tell us where the data stems from? For human footprint, there's a layer already, and it includes defragmentation. Are you saying that, would that be included? Or what do you mean? Well, let's look at that. We'll look at that with the team. Let me just state where you're mentioning, or let me jot down what you're mentioning. Celine? I have a question, thank you. I was looking at the different topics with regards to creating the map. And I'm not sure if this has to do with ecosystem threats, deforestation, forest fires exacerbated by human action or human intervention, or all of these threats that worsen the situation or the status of ecosystems, and the fact that they have to be prioritized because they're areas that are degraded. So I'm not sure if some layers are including that. Because I think this is tied to susceptibility. And there are more topics dealing with risk, and topics dealing more with risk. But, or I'm not sure where human footprint or anthropogenic activities would be included. Well, threatened ecosystems would include this. If you had another layer that you would like to add, you can maybe suggest that as a suggestion. But right now, I think that is part of threatened ecosystems with ecosystem diversity or diversity of ecosystems. And but this doesn't mean that it's not going to that the coverage analysis isn't going to impact this, because it's also being included, and it's that it won't be included in the overall analysis. Remember that we had mentioned this. So it would be interesting to assess this and see if it's going to be included or not. Let me know if I'm being heard, because it seems like the microphone is going in and out. For some reason, you're cutting off. Cassandra is cutting off. Okay, can you hear me now? Okay, great. Okay, we can hear you better now, Cassandra. The sound improved. Okay, so Liliana, let's add row 7 on threatened ecosystems as a comment. And in a comment, we can add, does this include forest fire analyses? So we see a comment with regards to the erosion and coverage layer. We see a comment. It says erosion, and that's row 20, and coverage is row 23. So we're updating this information. The information stems from the 2020 when the information was updated in 2020, but it's still not published. So let's just take a note of that, or take note of that. So I think we have to go a bit quicker because time is of essence and our session will be over very soon. And let's continue layer by layer. Biome mass. Are there any sources, comments on the sources that were used? That's the link that you can access. It goes back to 2020. Do you agree with that? Or is there more updated, are there more updated data sources that we should consider? Okay, I guess there is not, since everyone is silent. I think EDAM must have something, but perhaps EDAM needs to confirm. I'm not completely sure. Can EDAM confirm? Perhaps you can add that as a comment and we could go to foreseen carbon emissions from EDAM 2016.
Any update on this, or we have still the 2016 that is current? So 2016, otherwise Lina, Olga, you can write something in the chat. Now, soil carbon, 2017, FAO. Any more recent layer to consider? So, for that, it stays. Soil carbon sequestration, also 2017. From summer, soil, we have sequestration, global sequestration potential of increased organic carbon in cropland soils. We have that scientific report, a source from 2017. For which one, Olga? For which one of the layers? So it is soil carbon. Line 30, you mean? Yes, okay. For row 30, row 30, we should add in the notes that the Geological Institute wants to update that. The EGAC. Okay, let's move on. Soil carbon sequestration seems it is consistent. Total water demand. Olga, please, and her team, we have total water demand by 2014. IDEAM. So we will check this. We will include this as a comment. It's row 32. We had to revise with IDEAM, okay? The same applies to water vulnerability in drought. Water yield average year. 2022, we have the ENA. That's for row, which row? Vulnerability. Okay. 33, good. We can write ENA 2022. And row 33 under comments, we should include this question by Susana. Yes, Celine. I have a comment about 2 layers. I don't understand why they are there. It's poverty and invasive species, because this is ecosystem services. Why invasive species is there? Because invasive species is like a threat. D or Oscar?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Poverty is there because there's normally a link between income and poverty and the beneficiaries of ecosystem services. But in the case of invasive species, I think that would be maybe better grouped within land cover integrity. It's an indicator of land cover integrity.
Gracias.
Thank you for the comment.
Perfecto, eso lo podemos agregar. Gracias a ti, Oscar. Lo podemos agregar.
Thank you, Oscar. We can add that as a comment. And now let's move on to...
Sí, tengo algún micro abierto. Y Celine, no sé si es la mano antigua que quedó o...
Celine.
Levantar la mano. Perfecto.
Okay. Okay, very well.
Entonces tenemos índice de pobreza en las zonas rurales.
Poverty index in rural areas is the next one.
Lo más actualizado.
This is the most updated. Yes. Yes, Susana, that's right. It's not, it won't... So, poverty index in rural areas. This is the most current one. Otherwise, you can put it in the chat. And sorry? Poverty can be updated to the last year. Which year? Every year. And the last one would be 2022? Yeah. Okay. And Liliana has also responded about with whom we can update DNA data, and we have Black Community Councils. 2019 is the latest data, the National Land Agency. The same for indigenous areas. So we have to put that as a comment that perhaps there is more current information for both indigenous areas as well. How it is being updated. It's a very active process, okay. Perhaps we have more updated information, okay. Family farming.
Zonas de reserva campesina también nos comentan que podríamos
Peasant reservation areas, we should include as a farmers reservation areas. Natasha, perhaps you can tell us where we can find the source of information for that layer to include in the notes. And we have invasive species as well.
Antes de eso, ahí Liliana, estás tomando nota de los comentarios acerca de resguardos indígenas.
And there are comments about indigenous reservations, family farming.
Menciona Paola. Y sobre especies
and about invasive species. Are there any comments? Yes, Celine. I don't know if you can consider this. We can highlight the areas where we can have coffee and cacao systems to benefit the community, the local community. I don't know if we can highlight what ecosystem services are involved and which ones can be susceptible to pasture land or agricultural systems. Oscar D, anything to add here?
I think there is a feature about agricultural land that's already involved cacao and other agricultural land. Perhaps not the family farming. Or yeah, it could perhaps that layer was during the Alpha stage. But yeah, we do have the information about agricultural lands for cacao, for rice, and all these information. And if you think that's an important feature to be included, we can also add to the data stack.
Sí, sí, sería chévere si queda
Perfecto.
explícito porque pues esas
Entonces,
áreas son muy específicas en
Yes,
Colombia.
because those areas are very specific in Colombia. Cannot be implemented everywhere, but it should be explicit in the features in a single character, okay? We take note of that so that Liliana can include the layers that are necessary. Thank you, Dee, for your presentation, for your intervention. Now, the last one, pollination service. Invasive species, no additional comment. It seems that that's the only layer, the most updated one, right? So, 39 and 40 rows. Pollination service, it's updated to 2021. Is there a more current one? Shall we consider any further layers? Yes, the most current one is there. So let's go down and see what's the latest information that we have here, including restoration areas and the source of information we can use. Yes, we prioritize the agrarian reform, land reform hubs, yes. And with that, we have concluded. Are there any additional comments that you would like to make to complete the comprehensive exercise? Thank you very much for your cooperation. This is the starting point, in fact, to start the direct contact with each one of you. And thank you for the effort made. Susana, if you could open the microphone and ask the question to be asked by Dee or Oscar, please. Thank you, Cassandra. Yes, can you explain the rationale behind including a block based on the water yield?
Well, I think it's related to one of the most important ecosystem services in Colombia, the provision of water. The idea being that places that have the highest potential water yield might lead to the greatest water-related benefits following a form of ecological restoration, rehabilitation, or recovery. But maybe you yourself have a thought about it that you'd like to give to us?
Sí, es un poco de nuevo.
Yes, it's a little bit new, in fact, as a concept. The idea is to block the areas with the highest yield, right? Is that the concept?
To favor them, having them be one of the considerations. Yes, it's not necessarily blocked, like they're not locked in.
Okay.
But their potential to deliver water yield. Some places deliver more than others. Places that deliver the most, considering that as one of the many factors or potential benefits of restoration.
Okay, so son las áreas.
So it's the areas, water provision areas, right?
Yes.
Sí, la pregunta era si era una cosa generalizada.
So it was something generalized, taking into account the water yield. So there are ecosystems that are very powerful in this sense, and there are many that are not. So perhaps we can compare all ecosystems, and in that sense, it is unfair to compare all of them. But I'm not familiar with that layer to see if it is a relative representation or absolute representation at the level of the ecosystem.
I believe it's pixel by pixel, and because we standardize each layer on a 0 to 1 scale, it would be the same functionally if it's absolute or relative to other pixels. But I think this is hovering around, Susanna, your concern about some ecosystems falling through the cracks because they don't feature well for a given value. But from our initial discussion, we would like to change our way of running the analyses to setting targets by ecosystems.
Right. Yes. So that will solve also this probable concern. Yeah.
It should solve any concern around an ecosystem being good for one thing but not another, and then being overshadowed by a dominant ecosystem.
Yeah.
That all restoration goes to forests and none goes to savanna, for instance.
Right.
If we can get the right ecosystem map, we can't have hundreds of ecosystems. It almost needs to be we need to decide if it's the biome level, or if it's the Atlantic, Andean, Amazon level. So there's 3 divisions, or if there's a kind of a coarse ecosystem map for Colombia, we should use. We'll have to work through that detail.
Yes, cool. Mm, and I guess in that sense, sorry to be, but with the zones of restriction, right? So my understanding is that you want to use the integrity of landscape. But again, so Paola, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that that layer is biased towards forest, and in that sense, I might suggest using the threatened ecosystems from Ether because it has the IUCN categories. It kind of gives an idea of similar to integrity, which should be put more attention and is corrected by comparison across ecosystems. Just for you to consider that.
Okay, I don't know how we move forward. So one of the Enrique has been leading many of our consultation discussions, and one of the feedbacks he's brought to us, to the science team, was the importance of building off Humboldt's landscape integrity work. That was viewed as kind of foundational to restoration planning in Colombia. So that was one of the major reasons why we adopted it as really our foundational layer, which is the hard constraint for the planning. So I would be happy for us to identify a sub team to discuss that further, whether moving from landscape integrity to threatened ecosystems is a better way for us to go. But right now we've adopted what Enrique's brought to us as kind of guiding feedback from the national consultations.
Yeah, so there are two ways. Either, as I asked at the beginning, if zones are up for discussion, it will be nice to have that discussion more broadly. Or if they're not up for discussion, recognizing the limitations of bringing something that is biased towards forest in the final analysis and in the presentation of the products. And this comment is for the ministry.
Okay, great feedback, Susanna. And from our end, there's certainly up for discussion. It's a fluid layer for us.
Perfecto, muchísimas gracias por esta conversación.
Okay, thanks for your comment. And we're going to have more opportunities for discussion, but we're going to now move on to the next few steps, another presentation and bilateral discussions with institutions that are present, including the Humboldt Institute, which provides their invaluable technical assistance. Now, before that, I see that Luis Alberto had his hand raised. I didn't want to interrupt the interesting discussion. Do you have a comment? No. So sorry to interrupt. Well, this information was just sent to us. I just wanted to mention that. Well, and here is the Excel link that we've been using to work, and all of the information will be included in a Google Drive folder, and you will be able to access all of our presentations, our recordings, and other documents, and I copy the link once again. So no problem if you joined in late. That is no problem. What's important is to remember that and to click on the link. So we're now going to hear about the next steps to take for Colombia, and I'm going to give the floor now to Jamison Irvin, and she is the manager of the Global Program on Nature for Development at UNDP. And she is, well, we can say the brain behind this project. Thank you so much for joining us today, Jamie, and we hear you.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here with all of you today. And I want to express how first amazed I am that we had at one point 150 participants attending this 2-day workshop on restoring hope. This is a new record for virtual consultation. And to me, it shows how really important the topic of restoration is to Colombia. When Enrique talked yesterday about the vision for this project, he highlighted the importance of ecosystem restoration, not just to Colombia, but to the world. He highlighted the social and economic benefits. And in short, ecosystem restoration is probably the single most important action we can take today And the single most important first step in undertaking ecosystem restoration is prioritizing where we take action, and that's at the heart of this process. This project comes at a unique time for Colombia, as the ministry is developing the first national restoration strategy that will guide restoration efforts of the country through 2026. And we feel honored to be able to contribute to the development of a robust science-based restoration strategy. And we're really interested to see how we can apply what we learn from you to support other countries. So thank you to everyone for your involvement and genuine contribution to this project. You should know that you are helping us to learn how to apply this approach. This is brand new to us, so we are co-creating it with you. I'd like to take just a few moments, I know we're a bit over time, sorry about that, to reflect on the steps that we've followed, the outcomes that we've seen, and the next steps for the project. When we conceived of this project just a few short months ago with the Convention on Biological Diversity Secretariat, it was a natural choice to think about working together with Colombia to co-create a methodology, because you've done such incredible work already with the ELSA process, with your own spatial planning processes, and your work on restoration. And we thought we could mobilize the deep knowledge that you have on restoration and spatial planning. So we did connect with colleagues in our UNDP country office, and then immediately with government colleagues with that green light in hand. And it was such a pleasure to meet many of you in person in May when we talked about the project. And it also is a deep pleasure to connect with the Humboldt Institute and to see how we can build on what's been done and not reinvent the wheel. A special thanks to our colleagues in UNDP Colombia and the Ministry of Environment. We really look forward to bringing you together to shape the analysis of the map of restoring hope. So today we learned more from you about what the data sets might be in terms of nationally relevant data sets, and that was extremely helpful. The next step is that our science team will work with you and together as a team to collect any missing data sets that could contribute to this analysis. We'll build an online web tool to co-create with you the next iteration of the restoration map, as Oscar detailed in his presentation today. And then once the map of restoring hope is created with you for your country, it will not be the end of this journey. We hope that this map can support you in policy design and implementation on restoration. And we hope that the web tool that we co-create will enable the national team to generate new versions as new data sets come online. On our side, we really would be excited to showcase this work at global events, including Substa 25 in Nairobi in October, at UNCCD this fall, and also through the virtual Nature for Life Hub, which many of you have participated in the past in November. In the coming weeks, you'll get additional information on the second consultation for the Restoring Hope in Colombia process. And we look forward and hope that the participation is as high as it has been for this one. We will document, of course, all of what we've learned and make that available to everyone. To close, I want to express my deep thanks to all of our colleagues at the UNDP country office and our partners at the Ministry of Environment, and also to our own science team who really worked late through the night, early in the morning to get the data available. They are always working on making data available in a timely fashion. We could not have done this work without you, our participants and national experts. So thank you, everyone. And I look forward to hearing the results and supporting this work for the national consultation on 29 August. So thank you so much. Cassandra, back over to you.
Muchas gracias, Jamie, por tu intervención. Si tuvieran los participantes alguna pregunta o comentario general acerca del proyecto y los próximos pasos, este es el momento. Pueden levantar la mano virtualmente o dejarlas en el chat. De todas formas, tenemos también la oportunidad de escuchar a Liliana Corso, nuestra colega, además en el terreno, que nos puede dar un resumen también de lo que ha sido esta sesión y los próximos pasos. Quizá luego de tu intervención, Liliana, ¿hay alguna reacción de los participantes? Te escuchamos, Liliana.
Vale, perfecto, Cassandra. Muchísimas gracias. De nuevo, pues retomando las palabras de Jamie, muchas gracias a todos por su asistencia. De nuevo, agradecerles porque pues hemos podido capturar una gran cantidad de información y pues como bien lo dijo Jamie también, estamos co-creando esto. Entonces, toda esta información y todas estas discusiones que hemos dado el día de hoy son muy valiosas y pues estos son los espacios para seguirlos dando. También, de nuevo, queremos recordarles, y como también lo dijo Jamie, abrir de nuevo la invitación para que nos está haciendo el ministerio para el 29 de agosto. En el chat acabo de poner un link, ahorita lo vuelvo a incluir, en el que se está incluyendo un formato que servirá de insumo para este taller del 29. Entonces, por favor, si lo
This is
pueden
going to serve as input for August 29th. It's just a form. If you could just fill it out. Thank you again, and I'm going to give the floor back to Cassandra. Thank you, Liliana. So I think we all deserve a great round of virtual applause. And thank you so much for joining us. Congratulations to all of you. And this last exercise, yes, it was exhaustive, it was long, but it's the first time that we conduct this type of workshop of national consultation with key stakeholders for the Restoring Hope in Colombia. And we are beginning with Colombia as a pilot. So before closing, I would just like to emphasize the next steps. Okay, we said that August 29th, there is the national consultation for restoration in Colombia. Then we have a second consultation that will take place in the next few weeks. It includes co-creation of our restoration map. And then we will also have an opportunity to share results towards October and November and disclose these results with other stakeholders that you recommend. And next slide. I would also like, well, before we close, to thank the team that has made this event possible. We could not conduct this without the leadership of the UNDP Colombia office, and with a particular shout out to Jimena Puyana, who has provided her invaluable guidance and insight to developing and implementing this project in Colombia. Thank you, Zoraida Fajardo, Claudia Fonseca, who provide their technical know-how about spatial data for conducting this event. We're also grateful for their feedback in the attainment and search of more spatial data that we have been working with alongside of Claudia for the Colombia ELSA project. Thank you so much also to the resident representative in Colombia, Sarah Ferrer, who has provided plenty of support for the project. We had the opportunity of being with her in a mission that the global team held in May. We're also immensely grateful to the Ministry of the Environment and Sustainable Development, specifically Sandra Villar, the Vice Minister of Policies and Environmental Policies, who, although she was not able to participate yesterday, she was able to share a tweet with us. And we'd also like to thank Natasha Garzon, who made an excellent presentation on the restoration strategy. And she also was present with us today. And the Forestry Office of the Ministry of the Environment and all of the other colleagues who are also with us today. We'd like to recognize the important support from our technical partners at the Humboldt Institute, and special thanks to Paola Isaacs for her presentation yesterday and Susanna for her interesting comments today. I also would like to thank Jameson Irvin for creating this vision and truly being inspirational to all of us, together with Enrique Paniagua, Monica Mora, Marian Marigo, and Veronica Recondo, who, well, have been behind the scenes today, the last three, but they're working hard on this project. Thank you so much, team. The list goes on, but we have to say thanks. We have to say thanks to, well, to Dr. Oscar Venter, Scott Atkinson, Daizang, our spatial experts who have led the creation of rigorous scientific methods and making this possible. Thank you, Liliana Corso, our national consultant, for her support as a liaison and serving as a national counterpart between the global team and the country team, as well as the country team in the UNDP. We'd like to thank the interpreters, Thais and Veronica, for their patience and excellent work, and it's been a great pleasure. You're very welcome. And last but not least, we'd like to thank all of the participants for their time, their knowledge in shaping this project. And we hope to work with you, to continue to work with you to develop this project and look forward to co-creating the restoration map for Colombia. So we hereby end officially the first consultation round of the Restoring Hope in Colombia project run by the UNDP. We know that it has been a long day, but it's been a very productive workshop, and we're truly very happy for, well, your comments and for, and Ruby, thanks so much for your comments. Thanks so much for the comments in the chat. And Liliana will be knocking on your doors, I'm sure, so be aware of that. So see you very soon, and thanks again for your participation. Have a wonderful day. Oh, sorry to interrupt, Liliana, but I'm having a problem with the survey that you sent in the chat. We're not able to fill out the form because it doesn't allow us to continue. So we're going to get back to you on that. We're going to speak with the Ministry of the Environment with regard to the national consultation on August 29th. Let me just tell you what you have to do. It says, where it says institution or organizational entity, I'm in the Ministry of Justice, for example. And if I put ministry, it just blocks me. It doesn't allow me to continue. Okay. Would you mind contacting him on the side? Yes, don't worry. Take the link or take note of the link, and I will reach out to you and we'll resolve that. Okay, the link does not change. So just copy and paste it, and then we'll take note of that. Thank you for telling us. So have a wonderful day, everyone. How about if you include refresh or F5, refresh the page, and then you'll be able to move forward. Okay, thank you for that word of advice. Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye. Bye-bye, team. Thank you.